Thaddeus Vance Sterling stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office on the 47th floor of Sterling Tech Tower, watching the late afternoon sun paint Manhattan in shades of amber and gold. Below him the city pulsed with ambition, yellow cabs threading through traffic, pedestrians rushing toward their next conquest, the relentless heartbeat of a place that rewarded the ruthless and buried the weak. He had clawed his way up from nothing to claim this view, this empire, this life. And tonight, at the Sterling Tech Annual Gala, he would cement his place among the untouchables. His reflection stared back at him from the glass-sharp jaw, perfectly styled dark hair, touched with distinguished silver at the temples, a custom Tom Ford suit that cost more than most people earned in a month. 42 years old and finally worthy of the sterling name he'd chosen for himself. Born Thaddeus Vance O'Malley in a two-bedroom apartment in Dorchester, he'd shed that skin like a snake, rebuilt himself into someone who belonged in rooms where decisions moved markets and handshakes determined futures. The intercom chirped, his assistant's voice crisp and efficient. "Mr. Sterling, Ms. Whitmore is here for your 6 o'clock." A smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Send her in." Anastasia Whitmore entered like she owned every room she walked into, and with her father's net worth hovering around $3 billion, she very nearly did. 26, blonde, wrapped in a white Balmain dress that hugged curves designed by personal trainers and Pilates instructors. She crossed to him with the confidence of someone who'd never been told, no, never been denied, never had to wonder if she belonged. She kissed his cheek, her perfume expensive and unmistakable. "Ready for tonight." "The gala's been planned for months. Patterson's handled every detail." "I meant ready to announce us." Her blue eyes held his, assessing. "Daddy expects you to make it official. He's bringing the Whitmore energy contracts. $500 million contingent on you and me being more than just business partners." Thad turned back to the window. "I know the terms." She moved beside him, slipping her hand into his. Her fingers were smooth, uncalloused, decorated with a tennis bracelet that caught the light like captured stars. "You're still thinking about her?" "Vivian signed the papers 3 months ago. She's in some studio apartment in Queens, probably clipping coupons and riding the subway. Ancient history." "Then why do you look like you're standing at a funeral?" Because somewhere in the locked chambers of his mind, a small voice whispered that he'd made a terrible mistake. But that voice belonged to the old Thad, the poor Thad, the one who ate ramen and rode the bus and thought love mattered more than leverage. He'd silenced that voice years ago. "I'm looking at a future, our future. Whitmore Energy and Sterling Tech, the most powerful merger in the sector. Your father's connections, my technology, your pedigree." She finished the word sharp as a blade. "Just say it, Thad. You need my last name as much as Daddy needs your patents." He pulled her close, kissed her with calculated passion. "I need you." She smiled against his mouth. "Liar, but I don't mind. We're the same, you and me. We know what matters." What mattered? Money, influence, the right tables at the right restaurants, the right names on the guest list, the right woman on his arm who understood that marriage was a merger and love was a liability. Vivian had never understood that. Sweet, simple Vivian, with her 3 jobs and her earnest eyes and her belief that effort equaled worth. She'd been useful, once paid off his debts, supported him through business school, asked for nothing while he built his empire. But empires needed queens, not peasants. "I should go home, get ready," Anastasia said, checking her phone. "Hair and makeup at 7. Car picks me up at 8:30. Don't be late, darling. First impressions matter, and tonight half of New York will be watching." After she left, Thad stood alone in his office as the sun bled into the Hudson and the city lights began their nightly conquest of darkness. His desk held a single frame, him shaking hands with the mayor at last year's gala. Vivian cropped out of the photo because her polyester dress and forced smile hadn't fit the narrative he was building. He'd told himself it was kindness, sparing her the scrutiny, the whispers, the obvious gap between who she was and who he'd become. The truth sat heavier. He'd been ashamed. His phone buzzed. A text from Patterson. His CEO security briefing at 7 p.m. flagged attendee list for your review. Standard procedure. Sterling Tech Gala drew 500 of the city's most powerful, and with power came threats, activists, corporate spies, ex-employees with grudges. Security vetted every name, every +1, every waiter serving champagne. Nothing left to chance. He gathered his things, locked his office, rode the executive elevator down to the parking garage where his Tesla waited in its reserved spot. The drive home took 20 minutes through early evening traffic, the kind of gridlock that used to stress him when he rode the subway and counted every wasted minute. Now he barely noticed phone pressed to his ear as he confirmed details, adjusted schedules, ensured tonight's performance would run without a single flaw. The apartment, his apartment, the lease signed solely in his name after the divorce, occupied the entire 23rd floor of a building on West 82nd. When he'd bought it 2 years ago, Vivian had signed as a witness, trusting him, never reading the fine print that made her a guest in what she thought was their home. He'd told himself that was just smart asset protection. Now, stepping into this marble foyer, he recognized it for what it was, the first move in a long game of removing her from his life. Anastasia had already begun her renovations. The oak cabinets Vivian had painstakingly restored were gone, replaced by white lacquer and gold fixtures. The kitchen looked like a showroom, beautiful, sterile, unlived in. The couch where Vivian used to curl up with art history books had been donated to charity, swapped for a leather sectional that cost $15,000 and felt like sitting on money. He poured himself 2 fingers of scotch, the bottle a gift from Reginald Whitmore after they'd closed their first deal. 30-year-old Macallan, smooth as silk and twice as expensive. He raised the glass toward the empty apartment. To new beginnings. The scotch burned going down, but the apartment stayed silent. No Vivian in the kitchen humming off-key while she cooked. No smell of whatever simple meal she'd stretched to feed them both. No warmth. Just expensive furniture in expensive rooms echoing with expensive emptiness. His mind dragged him backward, unwilling to, 3 months ago. The memory arrived sharp as broken glass. July heat thick enough to choke on the apartment's AC, struggling against the humidity. Vivian at the kitchen island, hands red from scrubbing pots, wearing those awful jeans with the frayed hems and a t-shirt from a 3-pack. She'd looked up when he came in, smiled that hopeful smile that always made him feel guilty and resentful in equal measure. "Dinner's almost ready. I made that pot roast you love." He'd set his briefcase down, the manila envelope inside heavy with endings. 3 months of meetings with divorce attorneys, asset protection specialists, accountants parsing every dollar to ensure she got nothing, nothing, nothing. She'd signed the witness line on the apartment lease. She'd never asked questions about the European bank that had loaned them money. She'd been so damn trusting. "I'm not eating." She'd paused, dish towel in hand, that smile faltering. "Is everything okay?" "Work stress. We can talk. I'm leaving." The words had landed like stones in still water ripples, spreading, silence expanding. He watched her face process the statement, confusion giving way to fear, giving way to something that looked like her heart cracking in real time. "Leaving? Like a business trip?" He'd almost laughed. Even now, even as he was burning down their life, she was giving him an out, a gentler interpretation, a way to walk it back. That was Vivian, always making it easy for him, always smoothing his path, always asking for nothing. "For good. I'm filing for divorce." He'd pulled the envelope from his briefcase, slapped it on the granite countertop she'd chosen, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Her eyes had gone to the papers, then back to him, searching for the joke, the camera, the hidden angle that made this make sense. "Why?" Her voice had come out small, broken, and some part of him, the part he'd been strangling for years, wanted to take it back, to say he was sorry, to admit he was terrified of being happy with someone who reminded him of poverty and struggle and all the things he was desperate to forget. Instead, he'd said, "Look at you," gestured at her worn clothes, her bare feet, her simple silver locket, the only jewelry she ever wore, some cheap trinket from her dead mother. "I'm a CEO now. I have dinner with senators. I pitch to billionaires, and then I come home to this." "I support you." Her eyes had filled with tears. "I've supported you since you had nothing." "That's the problem." The words had come easier than they should have. "You remind me of when I was nothing. You're small, Vivian, no ambition. You're content with coupons and subway rides. I need a partner who fits my life now. Someone who can walk into a room and command attention. Someone like Anastasia Whitmore. She'd known. Of course she'd known. Women always knew. But knowing and confronting were different countries, and Vivian had lived her whole life avoiding confrontation, smoothing over conflict, making herself smaller so others could feel bigger. Anastasia understands power. She has connections. You have what a shift at the library. This is our home. It's in my name, check the papers. You signed as a witness, remember? He'd felt cruel saying it, felt the knife twist, but couldn't stop. You really should read things before you sign them, Viv. Too naive for this world. He'd checked his Rolex, a gift to himself after the Series B funding, $40,000 on his wrist while she wore a Timex. I'm meeting Anastasia at Le Bernardin. Pack your things. I need you out by Friday. Don't make a scene. You can't afford a lawyer who can beat mine. She'd stood there, dish towel still in her hands, tears sliding down her face, but she hadn't shouted, hadn't thrown anything, just nodded that terrible acceptance that had always made him feel powerful and poisonous at once. Naive, she'd whispered to the empty room after he left. He hadn't looked back, hadn't let himself. The memory released him back into his expensive apartment, Scotch glass, empty hands shaking slightly. He poured another drink, then another, trying to drown the ghost of who he'd been, who he'd hurt, who he'd abandoned to chase a life that looked perfect from the outside and felt hollow at the core. His phone rang. Anastasia. Thad, I need you to do something for me tonight. What's that? When they ask about your wife, your ex-wife, don't mention her name. Say it was amicable, say you grew apart, but don't give them anything they can use. Daddy says the press loves a sympathetic ex-wife story and we can't afford that kind of attention. Vivian won't be a problem. She's pathetic, I know, but pathetic women make for good headlines. Just keep it vague. After she hung up, he stood at the window watching the city below. Somewhere in that sprawl of lights and steel and ambition, Vivian was living a life he'd forced on her, starting over from nothing, while he stood in the apartment she'd helped pay for, wearing a watch that cost more than her yearly salary, preparing to marry into wealth that would make his old debts look like pocket change. The intercom buzzed, building security. Mr. Sterling, your car is ready for the 7 o'clock security briefing. On my way down. He changed into his tuxedo custom Brioni, hand-stitched in Italy, with onyx cufflinks that had belonged to some oil baron. In the mirror he looked every inch the self-made success story he'd crafted. No trace of the kid from Dorchester who'd eaten day-old bread and dreamed of having enough. That kid was dead. He'd killed him, carved him out piece by piece, replaced him with this money and ambition and a ruthlessness that got results. The security briefing took place in a conference room at Sterling Tech headquarters. Patterson was already there, flanked by the head of security and 3 analysts reviewing the guest list on multiple screens. We've got 500 confirmed attendees, Patterson said, pulling up a spreadsheet. Every major tech investor, half the Fortune 500, and enough politicians to pass a bill. Problem attendees. The security chief, a former Secret Service agent named Marcus, tapped his tablet. Flagged 12 activists who've targeted tech companies in the past 6 months. We've got facial recognition at every entrance, undercover security mixed with waitstaff and backup protocols if anyone gets aggressive. What about personal threats, ex-employees, anyone with a grudge? Marcus pulled up a new screen. We ran deep background on everyone. Most came back clean. But there's one name that raised a flag. He paused, exchanging a glance with Patterson. Your ex-wife, sir, Vivian Monroe. Thad's chest tightened. What about her? She's not on the guest list, but we found something unusual. 3 weeks ago, someone accessed the gala's vendor system using credentials that traced back to a Monroe family trust account. We initially thought it was corporate espionage, but the access pattern suggests what? Someone was checking security protocols, entry points, timing. Patterson leaned forward. Thad, I have to ask, is there any chance your ex-wife would try to crash the gala? Any reason she might want to cause a scene? Vivian. He forced a laugh that sounded hollow even to his own ears. She's a librarian who can barely afford her rent. She doesn't have the resources or the spine to pull something like that. Sir, the Monroe Family Trust has significant assets, over $3 billion in managed funds with ties to some of the oldest money in Boston. If your ex-wife has any connection to that family, she doesn't. But even as he said it, doubt crept in. Vivian had mentioned family in Boston once or twice, distant relatives she never talked about. He'd never asked, never cared, too focused on building his own empire to wonder about hers. Her parents were nobodies. She worked 3 jobs because she had to, not because she was slumming. Marcus didn't look convinced. I've instructed security to flag her face in our system. If she tries to enter the venue, we'll escort her out quietly. She won't show. Thad stood adjusting his cufflinks. Vivian knows her place. She always has. But as he left the briefing, something cold settled in his gut. The way Marcus had said Monroe Family Trust, the weight he'd given those words, suggested money and power that didn't fit the narrative Thad had built around his ex-wife. Vivian, with her cheap clothes and cheaper dreams, content to be small while he reached for stars. No. Impossible. If she'd had money, real money, she wouldn't have worked 3 jobs, wouldn't have lived in their cramped apartment, wouldn't have let him leave her with nothing. Unless. The thought arrived uninvited, unwelcome. Unless she'd been testing him. He shoved it away. Paranoia and scotch, nothing more. Tonight was about the future. Anastasia Whitmore energy, the life he deserved. Vivian was the past, and the past stayed buried. Friday had arrived with the efficiency of wealth-hired movers, donated furniture, a life dismantled in hours. Thad had returned to the apartment around 2 in the afternoon to find Vivian packing the last of her belongings into cardboard boxes. 3 boxes. 7 years of marriage reduced to 3 boxes that would fit in the trunk of the Honda Civic he'd magnanimously allowed her to keep. Anastasia had come with him. Her red Versace dress, a declaration of victory, her heels clicking against the hardwood like judgment with every step. She'd looked at Vivian with the kind of disdain reserved for things found on shoe soles. "Oh, you're still here, Thad, babe. I thought you said the help would be gone by noon." Thad had laughed, actually laughed at his ex-wife's humiliation. "She's just slow, you know how she is." Vivian had taped up the last box with methodical precision, then stood facing them both. Something in her eyes had shifted, some quality he'd never seen before. Not anger, not even hurt. Something colder, sharper, like metal folding into a blade. "I'm leaving, Thad, but I want you to remember something. Save the speech." He'd rolled his eyes, playing to Anastasia, performing his indifference. "Go find a studio in Queens. Live your small life." Anastasia had crossed to the kitchen counter, picking up a ceramic mug Vivian had hand-painted years ago, some craft project from when she still believed effort mattered. "Ugh, this is tacky." She'd dropped it, let it fall, watched it shatter against the floor pieces, scattering like shrapnel. "Oops. Well, we're renovating anyway. I need everything marble." Vivian had looked at the broken pottery, at the pieces of something she'd made with her own hands, destroyed with casual cruelty. And then she'd looked at Thad with those eyes that saw through him, past him, into the hollow space where his conscience used to live. "You think you know who I am, but you never asked. In 7 years you never asked about my family, my past, where I came from. You just assumed I was poor because I didn't spend money. Because you have no money." His patience had frayed, irritation bleeding through. "Your parents were farmers or something, you told me that." "I said they worked the land. I never said they were farmers." "What's the difference?" She'd picked up her boxes, balancing them with a competence born from years of carrying heavy loads alone. "The difference is everything, Thad, but you'll find that out soon enough." Something about the way she'd said it, the certainty in her voice, had sent ice down his spine. But Anastasia had been there, watching, judging, and he couldn't show weakness, couldn't let doubt creep in. "Don't come near the Sterling Tech Gala next week. It's black tie invitation only for people who matter. Security has your picture. If you try to crash it to beg for alimony or make some pathetic scene, they'll throw you out on the street where you belong." Vivian had paused at the door boxes in her arms, that silver locket catching the afternoon light. "Enjoy the apartment, Thad. I hope it's worth it." The elevator doors had closed on her face, and he'd heard Anastasia laughing bright and cruel. "She's pathetic. God, how did you survive 7 years with that mouse?" He'd pulled Anastasia close, kissed her to erase the taste of guilt. "It's over now. Let's talk about the renovation. You mentioned Carrara marble." But after Anastasia had left, after the apartment had fallen into its expensive silence, Thad had stood in the kitchen where Vivian used to cook, where she'd smiled and hummed and tried so damn hard to make a home out of his ambition. He'd picked up a piece of the broken mug, traced the hand-painted flowers she'd spent hours perfecting. Then he'd thrown it in the trash and called the contractor about the marble. Now, hours before the gala that would seal his future, Thad stood in his closet selecting a tie. Anastasia had sent 3 options via Courier Hermes, each one costing more than Vivian used to spend on groceries in a month. He chose the navy with silver threading, knotted it with the precision of someone who'd taught himself from YouTube videos back when he couldn't afford a father to show him. His phone buzzed. "Patterson. Monroe Trust just confirmed attendance. 3 representatives. Arrived via private jet this afternoon. Security cleared them." Thad's fingers paused on the tie. Monroe Trust. That name again circling like a shark in dark water. He typed back, "Who are the representatives?" 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Passenger manifest lists. Harrison Caldwell, Chief of Staff, plus 2 security personnel. No other names provided. They invoked privacy protocols reserved for heads of state and, a pause, and royalty. Royalty. In Boston. The old money families like to play at aristocracy, but actual royalty. Patterson was being dramatic, probably stressed about the gala going smoothly. "Keep me posted if anything unusual develops." "Will do. See you at the Met in 2 hours." Thad finished dressing each piece of his armor, sliding into place. Tuxedo jacket perfectly tailored. Shoes handmade in London. Watch that cost more than his first car. Cologne that Anastasia had chosen something French and exclusive. He looked at himself in the full-length mirror and saw exactly what he'd built, a man who belonged in rooms with marble and champagne, who shook hands with senators and signed deals that moved millions. No trace of the boy who'd shared a bedroom with 2 brothers, who'd worn second-hand clothes to school, who'd lied about having lunch because admitting poverty felt like bleeding in front of sharks. That boy was dead. But somewhere in the locked rooms of his mind, Vivian's voice whispered, "You think you know who I am?" He grabbed his phone keys wallet, headed for the elevator, tried to ignore the cold certainty settling in his bones that tonight somehow everything was about to change. The car service picked him up at 8:15, a black Mercedes with leather seats and a driver who knew to stay silent. Traffic crawled through Manhattan, the city dressed in its Friday night finest. Thad watched couples heading to dinner, tourists taking photos, the endless churn of lives intersecting and diverging. Once he'd been one of them, hoping, striving, desperate for a glimpse of the world he now inhabited. Now he was heading to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where the Temple of Dender room had been transformed into a temple of power. 500 guests, each one vetted, each one valuable. Politicians who could shape policy. Investors who could move markets. The kind of people who decided futures over canapes and champagne. And Anastasia, with her father's $3 billion and her family's connections and her willingness to make marriage a transaction instead of a trap. His phone buzzed. A text from her. "Just got to the Met. You're going to die when you see this dress. It's gold. Literally. Gold sequins. Gold heels. Gold everything. We're going to look like we own this city." He typed back, "Can't wait to see you." But his mind was elsewhere, caught on Patterson's message about Monroe Trust representatives and privacy protocols, and words like royalty that didn't belong in the same sentence as his ex-wife, who wore polyester and rode the subway. The Mercedes pulled up to the Met's side entrance, where security checked his credentials against the master list. Even here, even for him, there were protocols. Faces scanned, identities verified, nothing left to chance. The kind of security reserved for heads of state, Patterson had said. Inside the museum had been transformed. The Temple of Dender room glowed with soft lighting. The ancient stone temple reflected in the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Central Park. tables draped in white linen centerpieces of white roses and silver candelabras, a string quartet playing Vivaldi in the corner. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne and oysters, their movements choreographed to perfection. Thad accepted a glass of Dom Perignon and scanned the room. Recognized faces everywhere, the governor chatting with the Supreme Court justice, tech billionaires comparing notes on their latest acquisitions, old money mixing carefully with new. This was his world now, the one he'd fought and clawed and sacrificed to reach. Anastasia appeared at his elbow exactly as promised, gold sequins catching every light, heels adding 4 inches to her height, hair and makeup magazine, perfect. She looked expensive, untouchable, like something you admired behind glass. "There you are." She kissed his cheek, careful not to smudge her lipstick. "Daddy's by the bar with the Sinclair oil people. He wants you to come say hello, make nice. You know the drill. Lead the way." They moved through the crowd, Anastasia's hand possessive on his arm, her laugh bright and performative when she greeted acquaintances. Thad smiled, shook hands, played his part. The self-made CEO, the tech visionary, the man who'd built Sterling Tech from nothing into something worth stealing. Reginald Whitmore stood near the bar, a bear of a man in his late 50s, gray-haired and sharp-eyed. He'd made his first $1 billion in Texas oil, then diversified into energy infrastructure, building an empire that powered half the eastern seaboard. Next to him, Anastasia looked delicate, decorative, the daughter he'd raised to understand that marriage was strategy and love was weakness. "Thad," Reginald's handshake could crush stone. "Hell of a turnout. Your people did good work. Patterson deserves the credit. I just signed the checks." "Speaking of which," Reginald gestured to a quiet corner away from the crowd. Anastasia followed, her smile fixed in place. "The Whitmore energy contracts. $500 million over 3 years, exclusive partnership on the new grid technology. My lawyers have reviewed everything. We're ready to sign. Pending you making things official with my daughter." Reginald's eyes, cold as flint, assessed him. "I don't do business with men who can't commit. Marriage is a merger, son. Shows me you understand long-term investment." Thad looked at Anastasia, who smiled with perfect teeth and zero warmth. "I understand completely." "Good. Then we'll announce the engagement tonight, sign the contracts Monday, and by next quarter we'll both be richer than God." The logic was clean, transactional, exactly how Thad had been trained to think. Marry the girl, get the money, build the empire. No mess, no emotion, no risk of someone like Vivian, sweet, naive, Vivian, complicating things with concepts like love and loyalty and other weaknesses he'd excised from his life. "To new partnerships," Reginald said, raising his glass. They toasted, drank, smiled with shark teeth. And then the room went silent. The silence started at the entrance and rippled outward like a stone dropped in still water. Conversation died mid-sentence. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. The string quartet's Vivaldi faltered, then stopped entirely. 500 of New York's most powerful people turned as one toward the museum's grand doorway, and Thad felt his stomach drop into his shoes. 6 men in black suits materialized first, moving with the synchronized precision of Secret Service agents. Earpieces, scanning eyes, hands positioned near concealed weapons. They formed a corridor through the crowd, and nobody, not the governor, not the billionaires, not even Reginald Whitmore, moved to stop them. Then came a man in his early 60s, silver-haired and ramrod straight, wearing a Savile Row tuxedo that probably cost more than most people's cars. He carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades in proximity to real power, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. His eyes swept the room with clinical assessment, cataloging threats and exits and hierarchies with the speed of a computer processing data. And then she stepped into the light. Thad's champagne glass slipped from his fingers. Crystal shattered against marble, the sound impossibly loud in the vacuum of silence. Because the woman descending the museum's grand staircase wore Vivian's face, but everything else about her belonged to a different universe entirely. The dress moved like liquid midnight deep sapphire blue silk that caught light and transformed it into something beyond expensive, beyond beautiful, into the realm of art. It flowed around her body with architectural precision, structured yet fluid, revealing just enough to suggest power rather than sexuality. The neckline plunged in a perfect V, framing a necklace that made Thad's brain short-circuit trying to calculate its worth. 47 diamonds, each one the size of a marble, arranged in cascading tiers, with 12 sapphires the color of deep ocean water. The center stone alone had to be 30 carats, catching the museum's lights and throwing fractals of blue and white fire across the temple walls. The kind of jewelry that didn't get worn, it got insured for 8 figures and locked in museum vaults. Her hair, usually pulled into a simple ponytail, had been arranged in an elaborate updo that exposed the column of her neck and made her look like she'd stepped out of a Sargent painting. No other jewelry, she didn't need any. The necklace and her presence commanded the room with a gravity that bent light. But it was her eyes that stopped Thad's heart. The same hazel eyes he'd looked into for 7 years, except now they held something he'd never seen before. Not anger, not hurt. Just a cold, crystalline certainty, like she'd finally stopped pretending to be small and had remembered she was born to rule. She descended the stairs with the measured grace of someone who'd been trained since childhood how to enter a room. Each step perfectly timed, perfectly placed. The crowd parted without being asked, creating a path that led directly toward the Vanguard executive team, directly toward Thad. Senator Morrison from Massachusetts saw her first, and his face went pale. He turned to the woman next to him, some hedge fund CEO, and whispered something that made her eyes widen. Then they both executed small, respectful bows. Not full bows, nothing theatrical, just the subtle acknowledgement of someone whose family name carried weight in certain circles. The CEO of Goldman Sachs, a man who made presidents nervous, inclined his head as she passed. So did the chairman of the Federal Reserve. So did 3 Supreme Court justices. And then Patterson, Thad's own CEO, stepped forward and bowed deeper than any of them. His voice carried across the silent room, "Miss Monroe, we are honored beyond measure." Monroe. The name hit Thad like a freight train. Monroe. Not a common name in Boston circles. The Monroe family, the one that had been there since before the Revolution, that owned banks and railroads and half of Beacon Hill. Old money, so old it had stopped being money and become something closer to hereditary power. Anastasia's fingers dug into his arm, her manicured nails biting through his tuxedo jacket. Her voice came out as a strangled whisper. "Who is that? Why is everyone bowing?" But Thad couldn't answer because his brain was trying to reconcile 2 impossible realities. Vivian, who clipped coupons and rode the subway and worked 3 jobs, and this woman, this queen, who wore $60 million in diamonds like armor and made senators bow. She stopped 5 feet away from him, close enough that he could smell her perfume, white rose and sandalwood, the same scent she'd always worn, except now it smelled like power and patience and plans coming to fruition. When she spoke, her voice carried the same quiet warmth he remembered, but tempered now with something sharper, steel wrapped in silk. "Hello, Thad. 3 months since you threw divorce papers at me in our kitchen. You look surprised." His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His brain had fragmented into 1,000 questions, none of them coherent enough to reach his tongue. She turned slightly, addressing Patterson with the ease of someone used to corporate hierarchies. "Mr. Patterson, I trust you received the documentation from Monroe Trust this morning regarding the stock transfer." Patterson looked like a man watching his career flash before his eyes. "Yes, Miss Monroe, everything is in order. We've scheduled an emergency board meeting for Monday morning at 9 to formalize my position as chairman of the board of Sterling Tech." She turned back to Thad, and her smile could have cut diamonds. Controlling interest was acquired through 7 shell companies over the past 18 months. As of 9 a.m. today, I own 51% of the company you built, which makes you, she paused, letting the moment breathe, an employee, my employee. The room erupted in whispers, phones emerging from pockets, fingers flying across screens as the news began its viral spread. Thad stood frozen, his world tilting sideways, reality refusing to make sense. Anastasia found her voice first, shrill and defensive. "This is insane. Thad, tell them this is some kind of mistake. She's your ex-wife, what? Vivian's gaze shifted to Anastasia, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Please finish your sentence. I'm curious what stories Thad has been telling about me. Anastasia's face flushed red. You're a waitress. A nobody. You wore $20 dresses and took the subway. You can't just waltz in here wearing costume jewelry and pretend to be costume. The silver-haired man who'd entered before Vivian stepped forward, his accent pure Boston Brahmin. That necklace is the Monroe Star Young Lady. It was commissioned in 1774 by Elias Monroe for his wife Martha, using diamonds from the family's South African mining interests and sapphires from their Ceylon holdings. It has been worn by 6 generations of Monroe women, including Vivian's great-great-grandmother when she met with President Theodore Roosevelt, and her grandmother when she chaired the board of First National Bank of Boston. Its insured value is $68 million, though its historical significance makes it effectively priceless. He turned to Vivian with something approaching paternal affection. Miss Vivian, may I introduce myself to the room, Harrison Caldwell, Chief of Staff for the Monroe family estate. I've had the privilege of serving your family for 41 years. Reginald Whitmore pushed forward, his face the color of old brick, his eyes fixed on Vivian with sudden horrified recognition. You're Augustus Monroe's granddaughter, the heiress. Vivian inclined her head, a gesture so regal it made Anastasia's earlier posturing look like a child playing dress-up. My grandfather sends his regards, Mr. Whitmore. He mentioned you spoke at a fundraiser together last year, something about energy infrastructure. Yes, I had no idea. Reginald turned to Thad, and his expression curdled into pure contempt. You divorced Augustus Monroe's granddaughter, the sole heir to a $3.7 billion fortune. Are you completely out of your goddamned mind? Thad's legs felt like water. His vision tunneled to Vivian's face, searching for the woman he thought he'd known, shy, uncertain, always asking permission to exist. But she was gone, replaced by this creature who stood in museum light like she'd been carved from marble and ambition. Words finally crawled up his throat, desperate and wrong. You lied to me. Her laugh was soft, musical, and absolutely merciless. I never lied, Thad. I simply didn't volunteer information you never asked for. In 7 years of marriage, you never once inquired about my family, where I came from, why I had access to that European bank that loaned you $250,000 at 0% interest. She gestured to Harrison, who produced a leather portfolio and extracted a document with the reverence of handling a holy text. The loan agreement you signed on March 14, 2018. Do you remember it? I remember you helping me when I was drowning in debt. I paid that back. You paid back $0.00. Harrison's voice carried the authority of someone who'd built a career on precision. The contract stipulated repayment was entirely voluntary, to be made when and if the borrower achieved financial stability. You made $72 million last year and never transferred a single penny to Monroe Trust. The document appeared on a screen behind the string quartet's platform, projected large enough for everyone to read. Thad recognized his signature, recognized the date, recognized the desperation he'd felt that day when bankruptcy had been circling like a vulture. Harrison continued his finger tracing down to page 12. But the truly interesting clause is Article 7, Section B. Allow me to read it aloud for our assembled guests. His voice rang out with the clarity of a town crier announcing judgment. The borrower hereby acknowledges that in accepting funds from Monroe Family Trust and in marrying Miss Vivian Eleanor Monroe, the borrower enters into a binding prenuptial agreement governed by the Monroe Family Protection Act of 1891, validated by the Massachusetts Supreme Court in 1923 and recognized by New York State in 1957. Under this agreement, any individual not born into the Monroe family who divorces a Monroe heir forfeits all claim to joint assets, including but not limited to property investments and business interests funded in whole or in part by Monroe Trust resources. The words landed like artillery shells. Thad felt his knees buckle, caught himself on a nearby table. His entire world, the apartment, the company, the life he'd built, had been constructed on a foundation of Monroe money, the initial loan that saved him from bankruptcy. The connections Vivian had made through her volunteer work at museums and libraries, which he now realized had been her moving through her own social circles. The apartment lease he'd signed witnessed by Vivian that had probably been drafted by Monroe lawyers to ensure he owned nothing. Anastasia's voice cut through his spiral. "This is fraud. You can't just hide your identity and hide." Vivian's eyebrow arched, and for the first time real emotion flickered across her face, something that looked almost like pity. "I worked 3 jobs because I wanted to know if someone could love me for myself, not my last name. I paid my own way, lived on my own earnings. The only Monroe money that touched our marriage was the loan Thad begged for, which he signed without reading because he was too desperate and too arrogant to ask questions." She took a step closer to Thad, and he could see himself reflected in her eyes, small, scared everything he'd spent his life trying not to be. "You wanted to know if I'm angry about the divorce?" Her voice dropped to a register only he could hear. "I'm not. I'm grateful. You showed me exactly who you are when you have power. You became cruel, dismissive. You called me the help at your company functions. Told your colleagues I was too simple, too common, didn't fit your new life." Thad's throat closed around words that might have been an apology or an excuse. She continued, "I recorded it all. Every insult. Every time you forbade me from attending your events. Every email where you told me not to mention my past because it embarrassed you. Harrison, would you be so kind?" The screen changed. Video footage date-stamped from 6 months ago showing Thad at a Sterling Tech investor dinner. The camera angle suggested someone's hidden phone, maybe one of the waitstaff. On screen, Thad was laughing with a venture capitalist, both of them 3 drinks past professional. The VC's voice, "Where's your wife tonight, Sterling? Heard she used to work in food service, helped you through the lean years." On screen, Thad took a long drink, his face twisting with something ugly. "Yeah, she was useful back then, but now she's dead weight. Doesn't understand this world. I keep her home for these events, can't have her embarrassing me in front of real players. She's like, I don't know, like bringing a Honda Civic to a Ferrari dealership. Functional maybe, but you don't show it off." The VC had laughed. On screen, Thad had laughed too. In the museum present day, Thad wanted to vomit. The video cut to another scene, another dinner, this one from 8 months ago. Thad and Anastasia at some gala, her hand on his arm, both of them pretending the affair wasn't already in full swing. A board member had asked, "How's Vivian handling the new success? Must be quite a change from your startup days." Thad's response caught in crystal clarity. "Vivian's having trouble adjusting. She wants to stay small, you know, coupons and bargain shopping and all that poverty mentality. I've outgrown it. Hell, I've outgrown her." The screen went dark. Silence pressed down like a physical weight. Thad could feel 500 pairs of eyes on him, judging, cataloging, storing this moment for future gossip and schadenfreude. Vivian's voice remained steady, almost gentle. "You asked me once why I never talked about my family. The truth is I tried. I mentioned my grandfather in Boston, said he worked in finance. You told me you didn't care about my past, only our future. I mentioned family money, asked if you wanted to visit the estate. You said you'd built yourself from nothing and didn't need charity connections." She touched the Monroe star at her throat, the gesture unconscious, familiar. "Every time I tried to share that part of myself, you shut me down, because you didn't want a partner with her own history, her own power. You wanted a blank slate you could shape into whatever fit your narrative. The self-made man with the grateful wife who owed him everything." Thad found his voice, though it came out raw and desperate. "I loved you. You loved the idea of me. The girl who needed saving. The woman who made you feel important." She turned to address the crowd, her voice carrying to every corner of the temple room. "For 7 years I worked 3 jobs despite having access to billions. I paid rent on a cramped apartment when I owned a 20-room estate in Martha's Vineyard. I clipped coupons while my trust fund accumulated $18 million in compound interest annually. And I did it because I wanted to know, truly know, if someone could love me when I was just Vivian. Not Monroe. Not heiress. Just me." Her gaze swung back to Thad, and he saw something in her eyes that looked almost like mourning. You failed the test spectacularly. The moment you got a taste of success, you became ashamed of everything that reminded you of struggle, including me. You upgraded to Anastasia because she came pre-packaged with the connections and pedigree you thought you needed. Anastasia's face had gone from red to white to a mottled combination of both. She released Thad's arm like he'd turned to poison. Reginald Whitmore stepped between them, his expression thunderous. "Stasia, we're leaving. Now." "But Daddy, the contracts are dead. I don't do business with men stupid enough to throw away a Monroe." He turned to Thad, and his voice carried the weight of $3 billion in leverage. "Consider Whitmore Energy's partnership terminated, effective immediately. And son," the word dripped with contempt, "you just made the worst business decision of your life. Hell, probably the worst decision any man has made since the Dutch sold Manhattan for beads." He guided Anastasia toward the exit, but she twisted back, her voice shrill. "You're just going to let her humiliate us, Daddy, do something." "She didn't humiliate you, sweetheart. He did." Reginald didn't look back. "Come on. We've got better prospects than a man who values sequins over substance." The crowd parted for them like the Red Sea. The museum doors closed with a final boom, and then there was just Thad standing in the wreckage of his carefully constructed future, facing the woman he'd discarded like damaged goods. Patterson appeared at his elbow, his face professionally neutral but his eyes broadcasting panic. "Thad, we need to talk. Privately. The board is going to have questions about—" "The board reports to me now," Vivian interrupted smoothly. "And I have questions of my own, Mr. Patterson, starting with how Sterling Tech has been managing its finances." Harrison. The Chief of Staff produced another document, this one significantly thicker. Monroe Trust's forensic accountants found several irregularities in Sterling Tech's tax filings over the past 3 years. Nothing criminal per se, but certainly aggressive enough to warrant IRS scrutiny. Offshore accounts in the Caymans, consulting fees paid to shell companies, approximately $12 million in questionable deductions. Thad's vision grayed at the edges. Those deductions had been his accountant's idea, ways to minimize tax burden and maximize personal wealth. Aggressive but legal, his lawyer had promised. Aggressive but maybe not quite legal enough to survive a federal audit. Patterson's hand on his shoulder felt like a lead weight. "Thad, you need to call your attorney. Right now." But Thad couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't process the speed at which his world was disintegrating. 60 minutes ago he'd been standing on top of his empire, ready to announce his engagement to Anastasia, to sign contracts worth $500 million, to cement his place among the untouchable elite. Now he was an employee facing his new boss who used to be his wife, watching federal tax fraud allegations materialize out of thin air, and realizing that everything he owned, the apartment, the company, the carefully cultivated reputation, had been built on sand. Vivian gestured to someone in the crowd, and a woman in an elegant black suit materialized. "This is Rebecca Thornton, senior partner at Thornton and Associates. She'll be representing Sterling Tech's interests moving forward. Rebecca, please coordinate with Mr. Patterson regarding the emergency board meeting. I want a full financial disclosure and a plan for bringing the company into complete regulatory compliance within 90 days. The lawyer nodded, already pulling out her tablet to take notes. Patterson looked like he wanted to argue, looked at Vivian's face, and wisely kept his mouth shut. "As for you, Thad—" Vivian's attention returned to him, and he felt pinned like a butterfly under glass. "You're dismissed from the position of CEO effective immediately. You'll retain your shares, but your voting rights are suspended pending investigation of the financial irregularities. Security will escort you out. You can't do this." But even as he said it, he knew she could. She owned 51%. She was the majority shareholder. She held all the cards he'd been too blind to see her collecting. "I can do whatever serves the best interests of the company and its shareholders. And right now, those interests don't include a CEO under federal investigation." 2 security guards appeared, not the museum's, but private contractors, with the kind of build that suggested military backgrounds. They positioned themselves on either side of Thad, not touching but making the power dynamic unmistakably clear. "Wait." The word came out strangled. "Viv, please. We can talk about this. Whatever I did, whatever mistakes I made, we can fix this. You and me, we were good once. We can be good again." Something flickered across her face, not softening but acknowledgement of shared history. When she spoke, her voice carried a sadness that made his chest ache. "We were never good, Thad. We were unequal. I diminished myself to make you feel bigger. I worked 3 jobs and pretended to struggle so you could feel like a provider. I hid who I was so you could play the self-made hero. That's not love, that's performance. I didn't know." "You didn't ask. 7 years and you never asked about my family, my past, my life before you. You weren't curious because you didn't see me as a full person. You saw a supporting character in your success story." The guards shifted, a subtle indication that this conversation was over. Thad looked around the room at the assembled power brokers and politicians, all of them watching his humiliation with the fascinated horror of people witnessing a car crash. "The apartment is in your name, as you so gleefully informed me 3 months ago, but the mortgage was co-signed by Monroe Trust as collateral for your initial loan. I believe you'll find the paperwork specifies that default on the loan terms, which include the prenuptial clause, triggers foreclosure." She paused, and her next words fell like stones into still water. "You have until Friday to vacate. I don't have anywhere to go. You'll figure it out. You're a self-made man after all, built from nothing. Shouldn't be too hard to rebuild." The words could have been cruel, but her delivery remained neutral, almost clinical. "The guards will escort you to collect your personal items from the office. Nothing electronic, no files, no laptops, just personal effects." The security team moved with practiced efficiency, one on each side, guiding him toward the exit with the kind of firm gentleness used on people who might become unpredictable. Thad's legs moved automatically, his body in shock, his mind fracturing under the weight of catastrophic loss. As they reached the doorway, he turned back one last time. Vivian stood in the center of the room, the Monroe star catching light like a constellation around her throat, surrounded by people who respected her lineage and her power. She looked like she belonged there, like she'd always belonged there, like the past 7 years had been a brief intermission in a life that was always meant for greatness. And Thad realized with crushing clarity that she had belonged there. She'd just been kind enough to pretend otherwise, to stoop to his level, to let him believe he was her equal when she'd been royalty all along. The museum doors closed behind him. The night air hit his face like a slap. His phone started buzzing immediately, texts and calls and alerts, as the news spread through New York's social circuits at the speed of light. Sterling divorced Monroe heiress. Sterling facing fraud charges. Sterling banned from own company. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands, saw 43 missed calls, 200 texts, opened his banking app out of morbid curiosity and watched in real time as his credit cards were declined, his accounts frozen, the financial infrastructure of his life collapsing with algorithmic precision. The security guards stood nearby, professional and patient, waiting to escort him to collect his desk photos and his ergonomic chair and whatever other fragments of his former life he could carry out in a cardboard box. Inside the museum, through the glass walls, he could see the gala resuming. Vivian moving through the crowd with Harrison at her elbow, accepting congratulations, shaking hands, laughing at some comment from a senator. The string quartet had started playing again. Champagne flowed. The party continued without him because the party had never really been about him at all. Just another self-made man who'd mistaken temporary success for permanent power, who'd traded substance for surface, who'd thrown away a queen because he was too proud to admit he'd been married to royalty all along. His phone buzzed. A text from Patterson. "I'm sorry, Thad. Lawyers advised me to distance the company from this situation. You're on your own." Another buzz. His attorney, "Don't talk to anyone, especially not the press. We need to meet first thing Monday." Another. His accountant, "The IRS just called. They're opening an investigation. This is bad." The security guard cleared his throat politely. "Sir, we need to head to your office now. Building closes in 2 hours." Thad nodded, incapable of speech. They walked him to the waiting car. Not his Tesla he'd left that at the apartment, but a standard black sedan that screamed disgraced executive being removed from premises. The leather seats felt like ash under him. The city lights blurred past as they drove to Sterling Tech headquarters, and he watched his reflection in the window, a 42-year-old man who'd spent his whole life running from poverty only to discover that wealth without character was just poverty in expensive clothes. At the office, they gave him 20 minutes. He filled one box with personal items, a stress ball from some conference, 3 framed photos of himself shaking hands with people who wouldn't return his calls by Monday, a coffee mug that said, "World's Best Boss," that Anastasia had given him ironically. Nothing electronic, no files, no access to the systems he'd built, the technology he'd developed, the company that bore his name, but now belonged to someone else. As the guards walked him out through the lobby, past the receptionist who wouldn't meet his eyes, past the security desk where his building access was being deactivated in real time, Thad caught sight of his reflection in the polished brass elevator doors. He looked exactly like what he'd become. Small, diminished, a man who'd gambled everything on surface appearances and lost to someone who'd been playing a deeper game all along. The elevator descended 47 floors, and with each floor that passed, Thad felt another piece of his carefully constructed identity falling away. By the time they reached the lobby, by the time they walked him out onto the street and drove away, he was left with nothing but the truth he'd been running from his entire life. He'd never been self-made. He'd been Monroe-made, Monroe-funded, Monroe-tolerated. And the moment he'd forgotten that, the moment he'd convinced himself he didn't need Vivian anymore, she'd removed her support and watched him collapse under the weight of his own hubris. Somewhere in Boston, in a 20-room estate he'd never seen, Augustus Monroe was probably pouring expensive scotch and toasting his granddaughter's victory. Somewhere in New York, in the apartment Thad would have to vacate by Friday, his expensive furniture sat in expensive silence waiting for someone more worthy to claim it. And somewhere in the Temple of Dender room at the Met Vivian was dancing with a senator or a CEO, or maybe just standing alone wearing 60 million in diamonds and the quiet satisfaction of a plan executed to perfection. The car dropped him at a corner 3 blocks from the apartment. The guards drove away without ceremony. Thad stood on the sidewalk in his custom tuxedo holding a cardboard box containing the fragments of his professional life and watched the city move around him like he'd already become invisible. His phone buzzed one more time. Unknown number. Against his better judgment, he answered. Harrison Caldwell's voice, polite and absolutely final. "Mr. Sterling, this is a courtesy call to inform you that Monroe Trust will be sending movers to the apartment on Friday morning at 9 a.m. Please ensure all your personal belongings are packed and ready for removal. Anything left behind will be donated to charity." "Where am I supposed to go?" "I'm sure you'll find something suitable. Miss Monroe mentioned you're quite resourceful when motivated." "Good evening, sir." The line went dead. Thad stood there holding his phone and his box of failures, watching his breath fog in the October air, and finally understood what Vivian had tried to tell him 3 months ago when he'd thrown divorce papers at her. "You think you know who I am?" She'd given him 7 years to ask, to wonder, to care enough to look beneath the surface. And he'd been too busy climbing to notice he was standing on her shoulders the whole time. 6 months dissolved like sugar in acid. Thad watched his life disassemble with the methodical precision of a clockwork mechanism running in reverse, each gear clicking backward toward zero. The apartment went first. Friday morning arrived with professional movers who packed his belongings with the emotional investment of people loading a truck. They worked in silence, wrapping his furniture in plastic boxing, his clothes dismantling the life he'd thought he owned. By noon, the marble floors echoed empty, and Thad stood in the barren living room holding a single suitcase and the keys he was required to surrender to Harrison Caldwell, who accepted them with a polite nod and absolutely no commentary. The studio in Queens cost $1,800 a month and smelled like previous tenants' mistakes. One-room kitchenette against the wall bathroom the size of a closet, windows facing a brick wall that blocked most natural light. The building's elevator worked intermittently. The radiator clanged like someone beating pipes with a wrench. At night, the couple upstairs argued in Spanish with the passion of people who'd been married too long and loved each other too much to leave. Thad lay on a mattress he'd bought used from Craigslist and listened to their voices rise and fall, a rhythm of connection he'd never managed to achieve with anyone, not even the woman who'd given him 7 years and asked for nothing except to be seen. His phone had become an instrument of torture. Calls from lawyers discussing defense strategies he couldn't afford. texts from former colleagues expressing carefully worded sympathy that meant, "Thank God it's you and not me." Emails from reporters wanting interviews about his spectacular fall from grace. He stopped answering after the first week, let the voicemails pile up like accusations, watched his bank balance tick downward as legal fees devoured what remained of his accessible funds. The IRS moved with bureaucratic inevitability. Federal agents in cheap suits arrived at Sterling Tech headquarters on a Tuesday morning, walked out 6 hours later with boxes of financial records. The investigation sprawled across 3 years of tax returns. Every questionable deduction Harrison's forensic accountants had flagged now under microscopic examination by people whose job was finding fraud and punishing it with the full weight of federal law. Thad's attorney, a public defender assigned after his retainer ran dry, explained the situation with the weary patience of someone who'd seen this movie before and knew how it ended. "They're offering 18 months in minimum security if you plead guilty. Take it. If we go to trial and lose, you're looking at 5 years, maybe 7. I didn't know those deductions were illegal. Ignorance isn't a defense. Your accountant signed off, but you signed the returns. In the eyes of federal law, you're responsible." Thad had signed the plea agreement in a courthouse in Lower Manhattan, his hand shaking so badly the judge had asked if he needed medical attention. The answer was yes, probably, but not the kind doctors could treat. What he needed was a time machine, a chance to go back and ask Vivian about her family, to read the loan documents before signing, to understand that the life he'd built was on loan from people who could recall it whenever they chose. The sentencing hearing took place on a Wednesday in February. Snow fell outside the courthouse windows, blanketing the city in white that would turn to gray slush by afternoon. The judge, a black woman in her 60s with eyes that had seen every variation of human stupidity, read the charges with clinical precision. "Mr. Sterling, you've pleaded guilty to 3 counts of federal tax evasion totaling approximately $12.3 million. The prosecution has recommended 18 months in minimum security facility to be followed by 3 years supervised release and full restitution of taxes owed plus penalties. Do you understand these terms?" His throat felt lined with sandpaper. "Yes, Your Honor." "Do you have anything to say before I pass sentence?" What could he say? That he was sorry, that he hadn't meant to break laws, just bend them until they served his purposes. That he'd learned his lesson and would never again confuse wealth with worth, status with substance, the ability to buy things with the right to claim dignity. "No, Your Honor." She studied him with the expression of someone cataloging another entry in humanity's long history of self-destruction. 18 months minimum security. Report to FCI Otisville by March 1st. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell. Guards materialized to process his surrender date. Thad walked out of the courthouse into February snow and realized he had 3 weeks of freedom remaining, 3 weeks to somehow reconcile himself with the fact that he'd traded a queen for fool's gold and now stood bankrupt in every sense that mattered. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize. "Monroe Center for Women Entrepreneurs is seeking a warehouse operations assistant for our Newark distribution facility. $18 per hour, 6 days per week. If interested, contact Harrison Caldwell." The message included Harrison's direct number. Thad stared at it for 10 minutes, pride and desperation wrestling in his chest. This was Vivian's doing, had to be offering him a lifeline even after everything, extending mercy he absolutely didn't deserve. He called before he could talk himself out of it. Harrison answered on the second ring, his voice professionally neutral. "Mr. Sterling, I wondered if you'd reach out. Is the job real?" "Extremely real. We distribute emergency supplies to women's shelters across the tri-state area. The position involves loading trucks, managing inventory, and generally doing whatever needs doing. It's physical labor, long hours, no room for ego." Why would Vivian offer this to me? Harrison paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that suggested he was quoting someone else. "Miss Monroe said, and I quote, 'Everyone deserves a chance to rebuild. The question is whether they're willing to do it with their hands instead of standing on someone else's shoulders.'" Thad's eyes burned. "When do I start?" "After you complete your sentence. The position will be waiting when you're released. Consider it motivation to use your time productively." The line went dead. Thad stood in falling snow and imagined 18 months from now walking out of federal prison to a job offer from the woman he'd betrayed working for minimum wage to distribute supplies to women escaping situations he'd helped create through his example of how powerful men treat the powerless. The irony was so sharp it drew blood. FCI Otisville sat 2 hours north of New York City, a low-security facility that housed white-collar criminals whose crimes involved computers and spreadsheets rather than violence. Thad reported on March 1st with a duffel bag containing approved items, basic toiletries, a few books, photographs of nobody because everyone he'd thought cared had evaporated the moment his usefulness expired. The intake process stripped him to essentials: fingerprints, mugshot, medical examination, assignment to a cell block housing 60 men who'd made similar calculations and reached similar consequences. His cellmate was a former hedge fund manager named Marcus, who'd been convicted of insider trading and spent his days reading philosophy and working in the prison library. "First time?" Marcus asked, settling onto his bunk with a paperback Seneca. "Yeah. Advice: keep your head down. Do your job. Use the time to figure out who you want to be when you get out because whoever you were coming in is dead. Prison's good for that killing old selves. You either rot with them or build something new." Thad was assigned to the laundry facility 12-hour shifts, feeding industrial washers and dryers that processed linens for the entire facility. The work was mindless, repetitive, gave him too much time to think about the choices that had landed him here. He folded sheets and remembered Vivian folding his shirts, ironing his suits, performing invisible labor while he collected accolades for work that had been enabled by her support. At night, lying on a thin mattress that made the Queen's studio seem luxurious by comparison, he replayed their marriage like a film he was seeing clearly for the first time. Every moment he'd dismissed her. Every time he'd told her not to talk about her past because it made him uncomfortable. Every opportunity he had had to ask questions, to show curiosity, to treat her like a full human being instead of a supporting character in his success narrative. The weight of it pressed down like concrete, suffocating in its completeness. Letters arrived occasionally. His mother bewildered and hurt, unable to understand how her son had fallen so far. His brothers maintaining careful distance, their disappointment folded into platitudes about staying strong and learning lessons. Nobody from his old life. Patterson had disappeared into corporate liability protection. Anastasia had gotten engaged to a venture capitalist 3 months after the gala, their wedding announcement in the Times featuring a photo where she looked radiant and unburdened by association with failure. On a Tuesday in July, 6 months into his sentence, a guard delivered a package addressed in handwriting Thad didn't recognize. Inside, a book on art history, a field guide to American architecture, and a note written on thick paper stock that felt expensive between his fingers. The note was brief, unsigned, but unmistakably Vivian's voice. "These were the books I was reading when we met. I thought you might finally be ready to understand why they mattered to me. V." He opened the art history text and found her annotations in the margins, notes from 7 years ago when she'd been studying at Columbia, when she'd abandoned her scholarship to help him survive business school. Her handwriting traced connections between Renaissance patronage and modern wealth, questioned the ethics of beauty built on exploitation, wondered if art could redeem the money that funded it. Thad read until lights out, then lay in darkness, imagining Vivian at 28, brilliant and curious and willing to set aside her own dreams because she'd believed in his potential more than he'd believed in hers. Marcus's voice drifted down from the top bunk. "Someone important." "My ex-wife." "She visit?" "No, just sends books. Reminders of who I could have been if I'd paid attention." "Sounds like she's giving you a second chance at education. Most people don't get that. Most people didn't marry into the Monroe family and then throw it away because they were ashamed of polyester dresses and subway rides. Most people possess the basic decency to ask their spouse about their family, their past, their interior life. Most people weren't Thaddeus Sterling, who'd been so obsessed with climbing he'd never looked at who was holding the ladder. The months ground forward with institutional slowness. Thad worked laundry, read Vivian's books, attended mandatory counseling sessions where a prison psychologist tried to excavate his motivations for fraud and found instead a man who'd committed the greater crime of treating love like a transaction and people like assets to be leveraged. "You keep talking about your ex-wife," Dr. Chen observed during a session in October. "Do you still have feelings for her?" "I have regret, mountains of it. Whether that's the same as feelings, I don't know." "What do you regret most?" The answer came without hesitation, that I never asked her who she was. I just assumed I knew, and I was so completely catastrophically wrong that it destroyed everything. And if you could go back, I'd ask, I'd listen, I'd treat her like the extraordinary person she was instead of like furniture that should fade into the background and make me look better by contrast. Thad stared at his hands, calloused now from laundry work, no longer the soft hands of someone who'd only lifted pens and phones. "But I can't go back. I can only try not to be that person going forward." Dr. Chen made a note. "That's actually significant progress. Most people in your position spend their sentence blaming external circumstances. You're taking ownership. Doesn't change what I did. No, but it might change what you do next." December brought Thad's release date. 18 months served time off for good behavior, walking out of Otisville into winter morning cold, with the same duffel bag he'd carried in and a bus ticket to Newark. The Monroe Center job started Monday. He had 4 days to find housing, reacclimate to freedom, and somehow transform himself into someone worthy of the second chance Vivian was offering. The halfway house in Newark cost $500 a month and housed 20 men in various stages of re-entry. Thad's room had 2 beds, 1 desk, a window facing an alley. His roommate was a former accountant named James who'd served 3 years for embezzlement and now worked construction while studying for his CPA license again. "Monroe Center's solid work," James said, helping Thad unpack his minimal belongings. "My girlfriend works there. Says the director is some Boston heiress who actually gives a damn about helping women rebuild. Good benefits, fair pay. They don't hold your record against you if you work hard." Thad didn't mention that the Boston heiress was his ex-wife, that she'd orchestrated his employment as either mercy or irony, or some combination he wasn't equipped to parse. He just nodded and wondered what version of himself would show up for work Monday morning. The Monroe Center occupied a warehouse complex near Newark Airport. The building renovated to include office space, distribution facilities, and a training center where women learned job skills while escaping situations that had tried to define them by their worst moments. Thad reported to Harrison Caldwell, who appeared in the lobby wearing casual clothes that probably still cost more than Thad earned in a month. "Mr. Sterling, punctual. That's encouraging." Harrison extended his hand and Thad shook it, feeling the gap between their positions like physical pressure. "You'll be working under Maria Rodriguez, our warehouse supervisor. She's expecting you." Maria turned out to be a woman in her 30s, compact and efficient, with eyes that assessed Thad like a piece of equipment she was evaluating for purchase. "You're the tax fraud guy Harrison mentioned?" "Yeah." "Can you lift 50 pounds repeatedly for 12 hours? I worked laundry in prison. I can handle physical labor." "Good. Because I don't care about your past as long as you show up, work hard, and don't condescend to my team. We're all rebuilding here. Some of us are just honest about why we need to." She handed him a work shirt, safety vest, and steel-toed boots. "Get changed. We've got 3 trucks to load before noon." The work was exactly as advertised, brutal, repetitive, unglamorous. Thad loaded boxes of diapers, canned goods, hygiene supplies, winter coats. Scanned inventory, operated forklifts, swept floors. Did whatever Maria or her team needed, treated every task like penance and prayer combined. During lunch breaks, he ate with the warehouse crew, mostly people with records, mostly people who'd made mistakes and were grinding through consequences, one minimum wage shift at a time. They traded stories with the dark humor of people who'd hit bottom and found it surprisingly crowded down there. A woman named Sarah, who'd done 2 years for check fraud, asked him during week 2, "What did you do before this?" "You got the energy of someone who used to push paper." "I was a CEO, tech company." "No shit. How'd you end up here?" "Made some bad financial decisions, went to prison, Got out and took the first job that would have me. Sarah studied him with the shrewd assessment of someone who'd learned to read people for survival. Monroe Center doesn't hire random ex-cons. You know somebody? The director. We were married once. Her eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. You were married to Vivian Monroe and ended up in prison. Man, what'd you do to her? Treated her like she wasn't good enough for me when the truth was I was never good enough for her. And she gave you a job anyway that's either saints or strategy. Maybe both. Thad wondered that himself, whether Vivian was offering redemption or just dangling it close enough to make him understand what he'd lost. Either way, he showed up every morning at 6:30, worked until 7 at night, went home to the halfway house and studied the art history book she'd sent, trying to understand the woman he'd lived with for 7 years and never really seen. Months accumulated. Thad's body, adapted to the work, grew lean and strong in ways his expensive gym membership had never achieved. His hands developed calluses that matched the ones Vivian must have had from her 3 jobs back when she was testing his character and he was failing spectacularly. Maria promoted him to team lead after 6 months, a position that came with a $1 raise and the responsibility of training new hires. Thad found unexpected satisfaction in teaching people who'd made mistakes how to operate forklifts, manage inventory work together towards something larger than individual survival. It wasn't running a company, wasn't closing million-dollar deals, but it felt more substantial than anything he'd done at Sterling Tech. One afternoon in late summer, nearly 18 months after his release, Harrison Caldwell appeared in the warehouse wearing his characteristic Savile Row suit and expression of polite neutrality. "Mr. Sterling, do you have a moment?" Thad set down the inventory scanner, wiped sweat from his forehead, and followed Harrison to the administrative offices. The air conditioning hit like entering another climate zone. Harrison led him to a conference room with windows overlooking the distribution floor. "Please sit." Thad sat, suddenly aware of how he must look. Work clothes dusty from boxes, boots scuffed from concrete, the gulf between them wider than the polished table. Harrison opened a folder, extracted several documents. "You've been with Monroe Center for 18 months. Maria speaks highly of your work ethic and leadership. No absences, no incidents consistently exceeding performance metrics. Maria's a good supervisor. I just try not to disappoint her." "That's precisely the attitude Miss Monroe hoped you'd develop." Harrison slid a document across the table. "This is a full-time employment contract, salaried position as assistant warehouse manager. $45,000 annually, full benefits, opportunities for advancement. Are you interested?" Thad looked at the contract, at the salary that was less than he used to spend on suits, but felt like treasure after 2 years of hourly wages. "Why?" "Because you've demonstrated capacity for growth. Because Monroe Center believes in second chances for people who prove they're serious about change. Because—" Harrison paused, choosing words carefully. "Miss Monroe believes that judgment should be based on who you're becoming, not just who you were." "Is she here in Newark?" "Miss Monroe divides her time between Boston and New York. She oversees 12 charitable foundations, sits on 6 corporate boards, and manages a family trust worth $4 billion. She's quite busy. But she knows about the promotion. Miss Monroe reviews every employment decision at Monroe Center personally. She specifically noted your progress and recommended the salary increase." Harrison produced a pen. "If you're amenable, sign page 7. Thad's hand trembled, signing his name, the echo of signing divorce papers and plea agreements and every other document that had shaped his descent. But this felt different. Not a step down, but a step forward, permission to rebuild from someone who'd watched him destroy everything and was somehow still offering tools for reconstruction. "There's one other matter." Harrison retrieved a final envelope, this one sealed with wax bearing the Monroe family crest. "Miss Monroe asked me to deliver this personally. She said you'd understand when to open it." The envelope felt heavy, important. Thad turned it over in his hands, seeing his name written in Vivian's elegant script. "When to open it?" "She didn't specify. I suspect you'll know." Harrison stood, extending his hand. "Congratulations on the promotion, Mr. Sterling. Don't waste it." After Harrison left, Thad sat alone in the conference room, holding the envelope and watching warehouse workers load trucks through the window. People rebuilding lives, carrying boxes that contained supplies for other people, rebuilding an endless chain of recovery and mutual support that he was somehow privileged to be part of. He tucked the envelope into his locker unopened. Whatever Vivian had written, he wasn't ready to read it yet. Hadn't earned that intimacy, that glimpse into her thoughts. Maybe after another year of showing up, working hard, proving that the man who'd called her dead weight and furniture was truly dead, and buried under 18 months of consequences and 2 years of manual labor. Nearly 2 years dissolved like morning fog. Thad worked his way from assistant manager to operations director, overseeing distribution to 87 shelters across 3 states. His apartment upgraded from halfway house to a modest one-bedroom in Newark's University Heights, close enough to walk to work, far enough from his old life that he never accidentally encountered anyone who remembered Thaddeus Sterling, CEO. The Monroe Center staff became his community. Maria, who'd given him his first chance, became a friend who didn't hesitate to call out his bullshit when old patterns of entitlement surfaced. Sarah, the check fraud woman, finished her business degree and became Monroe Center's volunteer coordinator. James from the halfway house got his CPA license and now handled the organization's accounting. They celebrated birthdays and promotions, mourned setbacks, supported each other through the endless work of becoming people who'd learned from mistakes instead of being defined by them. Thad found himself thinking less about the life he'd lost and more about the life he was building, smaller, quieter, connected to purpose instead of profit. On a Friday in October, 4 years after the gala that had destroyed and remade him, Maria called Thad to her office. She wore an expression he couldn't read, somewhere between concern and curiosity. "Got something weird for you. Harrison Caldwell called. Wants you at the Boston estate this weekend. Said Miss Monroe specifically requested your presence." Thad's stomach dropped. "Did he say why?" "Nope. Just that a car will pick you up Saturday morning at 8. You're back by Sunday night. Whatever this is, it's important enough that Harrison's handling logistics personally." Saturday arrived, cold and clear autumn painting New England in rust and gold. The car, a Mercedes that made Thad's ancient Honda look like a toy, picked him up precisely at 8 and drove north through Connecticut and Massachusetts, arriving at the Monroe estate just after noon. The property sat on Martha's Vineyard, accessible via private ferry, 20 rooms of federal architecture overlooking the Atlantic. Thad had never been here, had never been invited, had spent 7 years married to the woman who owned this, and never once wondered where she'd grown up or what her childhood had looked like. Harrison met him at the entrance, his expression revealing nothing. "Mr. Sterling, thank you for coming. Miss Monroe is in the library. Please follow me." They walked through halls hung with paintings Thad now recognized from Vivian's art history books. A Sargent portrait, several Hudson River school landscapes, a small cassette that belonged in museums. The library occupied the entire east wing, floor-to-ceiling shelves containing what had to be 10,000 volumes, windows facing the ocean, comfortable chairs arranged around a fireplace where actual logs burned. Vivian stood by the window, silhouetted against Atlantic light. She'd cut her hair shorter, wore simple jeans and a cashmere sweater, looked simultaneously more casual and more herself than he'd ever seen her. When she turned, her expression held neither anger nor warmth, just the careful neutrality of someone meeting a business acquaintance. "Thad, thank you for making the trip." His throat closed around words that might have been apologies or explanations. He managed, "Harrison said you wanted to see me." "I did. Please sit." They settled into chairs facing each other across an antique coffee table, the silence stretching until Thad couldn't bear it anymore. "I don't understand why I'm here." "Because 4 years ago I told you that everyone deserves a chance to rebuild. You took that chance seriously. Maria speaks highly of your work, your leadership, your growth. I wanted to acknowledge that personally. You could have sent a letter." "I could have. But some things require face-to-face conversation." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes searching his. "Did you ever open the envelope Harrison gave you 2 years ago?" Thad pulled it from his jacket pocket, still sealed, the wax intact. "I didn't feel like I'd earned the right to read it." Something that might have been surprise flickered across her features. "And now, I still don't know if I've earned it." But I'm here and you asked, so maybe now is when I'm supposed to find out." She gestured permission. Thad broke the seal with shaking hands, unfolded paper that felt like history, read words Vivian had written 2 years ago. "Thad, if you're reading this, it means you've stayed at Monroe Center long enough to prove you were serious about change. That matters more than you know. I didn't test you 7 years ago because I enjoyed deception. I tested you because I needed to know if someone could love me without the money, the name, the power that comes with being a Monroe. You failed that test. But failure isn't permanent unless you choose to make it so. The question I'm asking now is different. Can you rebuild yourself without standing on someone else's foundation? Can you find worth in work that doesn't come with status or recognition? Can you treat people with dignity, regardless of whether they can advance your interests? If you're still at Monroe Center, the answer appears to be yes. I don't know if we'll ever speak again. I don't know if forgiveness is possible or even relevant. What I know is this: you're not the man who called me dead weight anymore. And I'm not the woman who would accept being treated that way. Whatever comes next, I hope you've learned that wealth without character is just poverty in expensive clothes, and the truest measure of a person is how they treat those who can do nothing for them. Be well, Thad. Be better than we were. Vivienne. He read it twice, then looked up to find her watching him with eyes that held 4 years of distance and something that might have been cautious hope. "I was so wrong about you." His voice cracked on the words. "About everything. I thought I knew what mattered, and I was just catastrophically, completely wrong. You were young and scared and desperate to prove you weren't the poor kid from Dorchester anymore. I understand that better now than I did then. Understanding doesn't make it hurt less. Doesn't change what I did." "No," she agreed quietly. "But it does change what happens next. You're not the only one who's been learning, Thad. I've spent 4 years examining why I chose to test you instead of just being honest. Why I needed you to love me without knowing who I was instead of trusting that you could love both Vivian and Monroe together. I should have asked. Should have cared enough to wonder about your family, your past, your whole life before me. Yes, and I should have trusted you enough to share it without making you pass a test first." She stood, walked to the window, spoke to the ocean. "We were both performing versions of ourselves. You, the self-made man who needed nothing. Me, the struggling artist who wanted nothing. Neither version was complete." Thad joined her at the window, careful to maintain distance, aware that proximity was a privilege he'd forfeited. "The work at Monroe Center helping people rebuild, it's the most meaningful thing I've ever done. More than Sterling Tech, more than all the deals and money. Actually mattering to people who need help, that's—" He struggled for words adequate to the feeling. "That's what I should have been chasing all along. That's why I hired you. Not as punishment, as opportunity." She turned to face him fully. "The board of Monroe Family Trust meets next month. We're expanding the Entrepreneurship Center, opening facilities in Philadelphia and Baltimore. We need someone to oversee operations across all 3 locations. Maria recommended you. So did Harrison. You're offering me a promotion. I'm offering you a choice. The position pays $80,000, requires relocation to Boston, reports directly to the trust. It's a real career, Thad. Not just a second chance, but a genuine opportunity to build something that matters." His mind spun through implications. Real salary, real responsibility, real chance to prove he'd learned the lessons his catastrophic failure had taught. And it would put him in the same city as Vivian, working within her organization, seeing her at board meetings and fundraisers and all the spaces where their lives might intersect. "Why would you want me that close after everything?" Her smile carried weight and sadness in equal measure. "Because I've watched you rebuild yourself from nothing, and this time you did it without standing on anyone's shoulders. Because the man who'd throw away his integrity for money wouldn't have spent 2 years working minimum wage to prove he'd changed. Because everyone deserves the chance to become who they were meant to be, and I think you're finally becoming that person." She paused, and her next words landed like benediction. "You can't undo the past. Neither of us can. But we can choose what we build with the rubble. I'm choosing to build something that helps people who've been where we were lost, desperate, willing to compromise everything for the illusion of security. You can be part of that, or you can stay in Newark and keep doing good work there. Either way, you've already proven what you needed to prove." Thad looked out at the Atlantic at waves that had been crashing against this shore since before the Monroe family built their fortune, since before he'd been born, since before any of this had mattered. The ocean didn't care about his mistakes or his redemption. It just kept moving, relentless and clean. "I'd be honored to take the position, on one condition, which is that you let me pay back the $250,000. Not all at once, I know I can't afford that. But installments, however long it takes. I need to know I didn't just get away with it, that I actually settled my debts." Something softened in her expression, the first genuine warmth he'd seen. "The loan was forgiven when we divorced. The prenuptial agreement, I know what the agreement says. I'm asking you to let me repay it anyway. Not because I have to, but because I need to close that circle. Finish what I started by actually finally taking responsibility for what I owed." She studied him for a long moment, then extended her hand. $500 a month. 42 years at that rate, you'll be 84 when it's paid off. Then I better get started. He shook her hand, felt the connection of skin on skin, the ghost of intimacy they'd once shared and destroyed, and were now carefully, tentatively rebuilding into something different. "Thank you, Vivian. For the job, for the chance, for not giving up on the possibility that people can change." "Don't thank me yet. Wait until you're 6 months in and realize how much work we're asking you to do for $80,000 a year." They both laughed, the sound surprising and fragile and real. Harrison appeared in the doorway with impeccable timing, clearing his throat discreetly. "Forgive the interruption, Miss Monroe. Your 3 o'clock is waiting in the conservatory." "Thank you, Harrison." She turned back to Thad. "I have a board meeting. Harrison will show you to the ferry. Your official start date is January 2nd. HR will contact you about relocation assistance." She offered her hand again, formal and distant, the gesture of an employer to an employee. Thad shook it carefully, aware that whatever they'd once been to each other had died in divorce court and been reborn as something stranger and more valuable, mutual respect earned through consequences survived and lessons learned. The ferry back to the mainland cut through autumn light gulls trailing behind, looking for scraps. Thad stood on the deck and watched the Monroe estate recede into distance, that 20-room monument to old money and older values, and understood finally what Vivian had been trying to teach him all along. Wealth wasn't the money or the property or the name that opened doors. Wealth was the capacity to fail completely, lose everything, and still retain enough character to rebuild without bitterness or shortcuts. Wealth was doing the work even when nobody was watching, treating people with dignity, even when it gained you nothing, choosing integrity over expedience again and again until it became your foundation instead of your facade. Thad pulled out his phone, composed a text to Maria. "Taking the Boston position. You're the best supervisor I ever had. Thank you for not giving up on me when you had every reason to." Her response came immediately. "You earned it. Now don't fuck it up." He smiled, pocketed the phone, watched the Massachusetts coastline approach. In 3 months, he'd move to Boston, start a real career, doing real work that actually helped people, instead of just enriching himself. In 3 months, he'd see Vivian at board meetings, interact with her as colleagues, slowly build trust through competence and consistency instead of promises and potential. It wouldn't be romance, might never be friendship, but it would be honest and whole and built on the rubble of everything they'd destroyed, learning how to be worthy of second chances. The ferry docked. Thad climbed into the waiting Mercedes for the drive back to Newark, back to his modest apartment and his modest life, and felt wealthier than he'd ever been in the penthouse with the marble counters and the woman who'd never really known him because he'd never let her see anything real. 4 years ago, Vivian had stood in a museum and destroyed his life to teach him a lesson. Today she'd offered him a chance to rebuild it properly. The difference between those moments was the work Thad had done in between, unglamorous, repetitive, humbling work that had sanded away his arrogance and shown him that the truest measure of a person is not how high they climb, but how they treat those who cannot lift them higher. He had 42 years of loan payments ahead. 42 years to prove that people could change. That failure could be foundation, instead of ending that. Sometimes the greatest wealth was knowing you'd earned the right to stand on your own 2 feet without needing someone else's shoulders to reach the sky. The Mercedes merged onto I-95 South, carrying Thad back toward Newark and the final months of his old life before the new one began. He closed his eyes and imagined Vivian in her library reading by ocean light, satisfied with the investment she'd made in someone who'd finally learned what she'd been trying to teach him all along, that you don't measure people by what they can do for you, but by who they choose to become when nobody's watching, and success isn't guaranteed. In his pocket, her letter felt like a contract more binding than any he'd signed, a promise that growth was possible, redemption achievable, and second chances real for those willing to do the work of becoming worthy of them.